Thank you guys for having me. It's great to be here in South Dakota to talk with you about cybersecurity, cyber policy, and cyberwar. As you mentioned, I'm going to talk for probably about, 30 minutes or so. And then I'd really like to encourage all of you to ask some really tough questions at the end so we can get a really good discussion going. Let's see if I can get my technology to work. All right, perfect. So it's the topic of today's lecture, and by the way, I am going to be using visuals for two reasons. First is I think this is a very complex subject, and I think it can be helpful to have something to reference as I go through the discussion. And as a former Air Force officer, I'm pretty much useless without my primary weapon system, which is, of course, PowerPoint. So we're going to use a few of these throughout the rest of the lecture. And by the way, yes, this does mean something. If anyone can figure that out, please do let me know. I won't give you too much time. Okay, so let's talk about cybersecurity. As many of you probably recognize, this is a term that is kind of made up and has come to mean many different things over the last couple decades. And as such, it kind of means all things to all people. So I thought it would be a good idea to start off with a very quick definition, just so we can all understand what we're going to be talking about here today and be on the same page. So the definition that I chose to go with is the one that we used in the military. That is, cyberspace is the domain characterized by the use of electronics and the electromagnetic spectrum to store, modify, and exchange data via network systems and associated physical infrastructures. That's great. Actually, that's not that great. That's an incredibly broad definition if you think about it. That includes everything from CDs, DVDs, the internet, email, satellite communications, text messages, anything, right, that uses electronic communications is actually technically in this definition of cyberspace. And this, once again, is considered a domain for military operations, right? It's an incredibly broad definition, an incredibly broad domain, but it is the one that we use today for cyber operations. Okay, so this is what we'll be talking about today. First, I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about the history and just a very little bit about the architecture of the internet. This is not going to be a technical conversation, but I do think it's helpful to have a very basic understanding of what a network looks like in order to understand some of the challenges and opportunities in cyberspace. Then we're going to talk about some of the vulnerabilities as well as some of the threats. Who are the bad guys out there that are trying to do us harm and why? And then finally, what are the implications for national security, foreign policy, conflict, war, peace, all of the above. Okay, so why is cyber so important? I think this is a question that's beginning to answer itself in recent days with the Edward Snowden leaks, with the massive attack on Target, but there are a couple other reasons as well. If you look back to 2007, 2008, we saw what was possibly the first use of cyberspace in a hostile environment, right? If you guys recall back to that time, Estonia and Georgia were having some, these are states in the former Soviet Union, were having some internal trouble, and they were essentially cyber attacked by what seemed to have been Russia, right, in an effort to kind of interfere in what was going on in their political establishment. That was a major wake-up call to the international community, the first time cyber was used in an international conflict in that sense. The next reason why this is so important, the massive loss of intellectual property, the massive loss of economic data, the massive loss of private information that cost potentially billions of dollars annually. I'll tell you frankly, we're not really sure how much it costs. Billions seems to be the right number, but it's so hard to get our arms wrapped around that we're not exactly sure. We believe it's in the billions, it may be more. And then finally, and this is the biggest concern for the government, is the growing threat to what we consider, what we call our critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure includes things such as the electric grid, the air traffic control system, the water system, nuclear power plants, anything that we critically depend on in order for our society to operate, and if it were to be taken offline, could be catastrophic, right? These things, as they become more connected and more connected to the internet and become more online, are also becoming vectors that can be attacked, and we're starting to see that happen today, and this has our government very concerned. So these are some reasons why we are concerned about cybersecurity and cyberspace today. As we go through the discussion, I'd like you guys to kind of keep these three things in mind. Number one, cyberspace. As I've mentioned before, this is a little bit of a controversial thing to say, but cyberspace has been classified as a domain by the military. However, unlike all of the other domains, and the other domains are things like air, water, land, space, right? The traditional spaces where we think about military conflict. Cyberspace is completely man-made, right? And it is also, especially in the Western world, private sector owned and operated, right? There is no other domain that remotely meets that definition. Second, cyber, in the government sense, is a derivative of something called signals intelligence, which is a form of electronic communication espionage that has existed for decades. And as we developed more reliance on computers and online systems, signals intelligence moved to become synonymous with cyber. So when the government thinks about cyber, they're often thinking about surveillance and signals intelligence. This is something to keep in mind as we go through. And then finally, this is something I mentioned at a dinner we had just a few moments ago. We're in the middle of a major revolution right now, a major societal revolution, the information age revolution. There have been several of these in the past, right? The first was the agricultural revolution, which happened thousands of years ago. That revolution also had an impact on military operations, right? The agricultural revolution allowed us to go from being hunter-gatherers to living in societies, which allowed us to have the rise of professional trades, including a professional standing army, which had not existed until that time. Revolutionized warfare. Later on, you had the Industrial Revolution, which gave us not only planes, trains, and automobiles, but also gave us mechanized warfare, right? Warfare on an industrial scale, which we began to see in the Civil War and probably reached its apex in World War II, right? So each one of these revolutions has had a major impact on how we conduct warfare. And now, as we're in the middle of the information age revolution, we're going to be seeing that again. What is the outcome going to be? What is the effect going to be? It's a little bit too early to tell, but it's almost certainly going to be something, and probably something quite major. Okay, so enough of the intro. Let's talk about the history and the architecture. Just a quick note, this is a graphical representation of the internet with these, I think I have a pointer here, with these little starburst things here are big nodes, and these lines are basically pathways, internet connections. So that's kind of like what the internet looks like in a graphic image. And then this, I don't know if you guys can see, is the first Apple computer. That's what it looked like. A little bit different today. All right, so let's talk about the birth of the internet. Some of you may know this already, but the internet was invented primarily by a defense agency called the Advanced Research Projects Agency. That agency is now named the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, and it was called the ARPANET. It was an experiment that was designed by scientists and researchers to see if they could communicate with each other. And as you can see, there was just a couple different points. Some guys on the East Coast want to talk with some other people on the West Coast, some people in between, just to see if they could share research, just to see if they could do it. There was absolutely no notion that the internet would be what it is today, that there would be billions of people accessing it, that people would have personal computers. That really didn't exist as a thing back then. That wasn't a notion in their mind. Security wasn't a concern either. Why would you need to be secure? You kind of, it's just a couple researchers. You don't need to worry about bad guys getting on the system. So these things weren't really considered. Also at this time, it was actually illegal to conduct commerce on the internet. This was considered to be a government backbone, and conducting commerce was against the law. It wasn't until 1992 that changed, and with it, the internet became what it is today, this massive place for e-commerce and social networking and everything that it is today. Okay, so this is going to be like the most technical part of the briefing, so try not to laugh. So this is your basic scenario, right? So let's say I'm sitting here at my computer, and I'm a surfer, I enjoy surfing, and maybe I want to take a trip to Australia, check out the surf, awesome. So I say, okay, internet, take me to the Australia webpage so I can check it out. And this is the internet, okay? Which is pretty much what all of us think about when we think of the internet. So what's actually happening when we do that, right? When we go to the internet and say, bring me this webpage about Australia. What happens is, you're sitting here at your computer, you basically make a request. to something called, to your server, right? DNS up there means domain name system. It's not important. You make a request to this server. This server is a lot like an operator, right? Back in the day, you might make a request of the operator. I would really like to talk to Jeannie Manzer, operator, and she lives in South Dakota. Can you connect me? And the operator would have a little phone book in there, and they'd look them up, and they'd say, yeah, sure, here's her phone number. Let me connect you, okay? Somewhat similar in concept. So you make the request in English. I want to go to the website, australia.gov.au. It sends a request to this server. The server looks in its registry, in its phone book, and says, you know what, I don't know that address. Let me ask this guy. So it goes and asks a different server, a very basic, a root server. The root server says, I don't really know that person either, but I do know the .au server. Let's go ask him. And so you ask him instead. And you talk to the AU server, and he says, no, I don't really know that guy either, but I do know the .gov AU server. So you can see you're starting to get closer and closer to where you need to go. And finally, you reach this server, and this server says, yes, I do know this address. Here is the actual phone number, which is called an IP address, so you can go ahead and talk to them, right? And then you can make a connection and start sending information back and forth. So why did I just subject you to this? It's to show a couple things. Number one, that the internet's fairly loosely coupled, right? It's not a very rigorous or very rigid network. And there are any number of places for bad guys to hide. In here, in here, in here. They can pretend to be this guy. They can pretend to be this guy. So it's actually, it can actually be quite an easy place to try to get away with bad activity if you want. Taking one larger step, this is what your typical network looks like. Maybe here on campus, maybe at your business. You're sitting here, you're making the same request out to the internet. Instead, you have to go through all of these different routers and switches. You have to go through firewalls and all this kind of stuff. Incredibly complex, right? The central message from here, this is very complex. It's very expensive, and it can take time. And again, all of these places are also places of potential vulnerability. And then finally, once you get out to the internet, there's you and your little network with your little firewalls, and there's Australia. This is kind of what the internet looks like. You have giant internet exchange points. These are physical points where the internet actually comes together. There's one in Miami, for example. These are your tier 1 internet service providers. They can basically connect everywhere in the world. This is like AT&T and Verizon and whatnot. Then you have your tier 2 internet service providers. They have some connections, but they also take some from the tier 1 ISPs. And then you have your smaller ones that get everything from everyone else. So again, more complexity, more places to hide, and importantly for surveillance, anything that goes across these guys' networks, they get to see everything. They can see everything that goes across their network, right? So when we talk about the government going to ISPs and asking for information, this is essentially where that's happening, because you can see they see everything between you and what you're trying to get at. Okay. That's it. That's the technical part of the discussion. As if that wasn't bad enough, the rules and laws and policies that dictate how we operate in cyberspace are probably even more complex and probably even more loosely coupled. If we wanted to conduct, in the United States, a cyber operation in a target state, whatever country you want, these are some things that we'd have to consider, right? We have third party. Maybe there's a server in here that we have to go through before we can get here. There's the internet, satellites. So we'd have to consider, first, U.S. domestic law. Is what we're doing in the U.S. legal? There's probably about 12 laws that you have to look through right there before you can do anything just domestically. Then you have to think about international law. Is what we're doing going to get us in trouble regarding the law of war? Is it going to get us called to the Hague as war criminals? You have to consider telecommunications law. You have to consider the telecommunications law of the foreign country. You have to consider humanitarian law, law of the sea, law of the air. It's like just name whatever law you want. More foreign law, law of the target state, right? As an attorney, and this is why we're so gainfully employed, you have to actually think through all of these things. Every time someone in the United States figures out a technical solution, we're going to go zap these guys. You have to figure out all of this before they can even do it, right? So there is just as much complexity and just as much work to be done when it comes to the rules and laws, maybe even more so than there is when it comes to the technology. Okay, so with those fundamentals out of the way, let's take a quick look at the vulnerabilities and the threats. This is just a stupid, it's a bug, it's just a joke. Anonymous, I think most people know what that is, kind of a hacktivist collective. Anyone know what this is? Anyone want to take a guess? It is in Chinese, yes. This is allegedly a screenshot from a Chinese military computer that has a list of targets and a little button here that says launch cyber attack. So that's kind of a user interface for a cyber attack, allegedly. Okay, so let's talk about our vulnerabilities. What are we facing? Today, as we talked about a minute ago, we're facing loss of intellectual property, loss of government secrets, threats to our privacy, credit card information, financial data, threats to our critical systems, as I mentioned before, right? Those are all really top concerns. Additionally, as if that wasn't enough, we're also facing risk in our supply chain. As more and more of our IT products are built and designed overseas, the less likely we are going to be able to guarantee their security. In fact, we can't. We can't do it. So supply chain security is also a big concern. If you can get something in the supply chain, it's going to be very hard for us to detect and very hard for us to stop. So this is also a growing concern for us. And then finally, this last point here talks about the code itself. I talked about how the internet is relatively kind of loosely put together, didn't really have security in mind. The code itself is also vulnerable. This is, statistically speaking, you're going to have about 10 to 50 errors per every 1,000 lines of code, right? There's really nothing you can do about it. It's just going to happen, largely due to human error, a couple other factors. All you can do is try to control for it, which means that code is inherently vulnerable. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie, I assume everybody has seen the movie The Matrix. This is partially the justification for Keanu Reeves' character, right? He's this anomalous thing in code that can't be controlled, only contained, and then he overthrows the entire world. Hopefully that last part doesn't happen. But that's the whole kind of premise for Keanu Reeves' character, right, is this notion. So what does that mean? Our programs are insecure. They have vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Also, what this shows is that malware, the bad code, and good code, the stuff we do to try to defend against it, originally both started off at kind of the same level, right? Really, really small, really lean, not very vulnerable. Malware, bad code, has stayed that way. Malware has stayed over the decades small, average speaking, right? Average speaking here. It's stayed very easy to use, very inexpensive. What we're doing to defend against it has gone from parity to now 10 million lines of code in our security systems today, which means that not only are our normal software programs vulnerable, but the security programs that we use to protect those programs are also massively vulnerable. And getting more so, right? Getting more so, diverging with the threat. This kind of thing right here terrifies military planners. You do not want to see divergence like this because this becomes more vulnerable and more expensive. This gets relatively cheaper. And that's one of the reasons why offense has a little bit of an advantage today over defense. Okay, so those are some of the vulnerabilities. What are some techniques that bad guys are using to try to get us? I'm sure some of you are familiar with these terms already, but I'll go through them very quickly. Number one of the most popular is called a distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS attack. This is basically where you kind of launch a lot of internet traffic at a target and kind of knock them offline for a while so they can't communicate. It's very effective. It's very popular. A botnet is a collection of compromised computers, so you have, instead of just using one computer to attack a bunch of people, you maybe enslave a bunch of computers to launch a coordinated attack. Phishing, this is the idea of you kind of pretending to be someone else in order to trick someone into like clicking on a bad link or opening up a bad file. Incidentally, it's not clear yet, but this could have happened to Target. That could have been how the malware got into Target, an email that looked like it was from someone that it wasn't. Trojan, this also probably happened at Target. A software that does something other than advertised. You think it's a good piece of software. It's actually a really bad piece of software disguised as a good piece of software. Virus, this is typical malware, self-replicating file. A worm, similar to a virus, but doesn't need to attach to an existing program. And man in the middle, this is where, when you remember that diagram of the network, if you sit kind of in between the user and where they want to go and pretend to be where they want to go, you can kind of just observe all of their traffic, right? So all of these things are common techniques, common definitions. All of them are being used. And then, again, to bring it back to Target, several of these were probably used in the Target hack very, very effectively. All right, enough of that. So who's trying to do this to us, right? Who are the people and the countries and the organizations that we really need to be concerned about? In terms of capability, starting with the most capable, at the top, you have nation states, other countries. Everybody's heard about China. They're a huge threat, right? They're very capable. Russia is another country with enormous cyber capabilities. The United States, tremendous cyber capabilities. Great Britain has great cyber capabilities, and so on. So nation states are the most capable. Next down the list, I would argue, you have sophisticated non-state actors. These are organizations like Eastern European criminal enterprises, right? Hacktivist collectives, like potentially Anonymous, for example. Below that, you have terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, if they had much of a cyber presence. Right now, they're not terribly sophisticated, but they're very eager to develop these capabilities. Below that, you have kind of your traditional lone wolf hacker. Can be capable, but usually not as much as these groups. And then lastly, not very capable, but potentially very dangerous and able to do a lot of damage are insiders, right? This is this is Edward Snowden, basically, someone that has access to your server, to your information internally, and can just walk off with it, right? This is often underreported, insiders, but that is a huge challenge for companies, a huge challenge for governments, because these people are there legally, they're there lawfully, and they end up betraying your trust and walking off with information. So that's another potential threat. But I think it's important to point out that threat is not just about capability, right? Threat is about capability and intent intersecting at the same time. So when it comes to like the idea of who wants to do America harm, I would argue that although nation states have a lot of capability, they probably don't have the biggest intent. They want to spy on us, but I'm not so sure they want to actually hurt us. If they did, that would be an act of war, right? That wouldn't be good for them. So they're probably not the greatest threat right now when it comes to actual damage. Potentially, these guys are worse. Or terrorists if they can get more capability. So the notion here is that when thinking about who is after you and what you need to protect, you need to think about not only who can do this, but who wants to do it, and see if they intersect, right, somewhere on this arrow. And if so, then you have a problem. If they don't, then maybe you got some breathing room. Okay, so what does all this mean for conflict? Number one, as I said, the primary concern of the United States government, critical infrastructure. This is the nightmare scenario. When people talk about cyber Pearl Harbors and cyber apocalypse, this is what they mean, right? They're worried about someone hacking in to our air traffic control system and crashing planes, or shutting down our electricity grid, or doing something in the stock market. By the way, the stock market, the New York Stock Exchange, has been penetrated before. And there's reason to believe that hostile actors are starting to snoop around in some of these networks. So this is something that is very much of a concern to the government right now. Right? If these things go down, it's terrible, terrible news for us. Right now, the question is both one of capability and intent. Who has the capability to do this? I'm not really sure. This is hard. Taking down critical infrastructure, very, very hard. Also, our critical infrastructure is like really, really old. So most of it's not online, or people who know how to hack it, are too old and don't know how to do it anymore. But that's going to change, right? That's going to change as these things become more modernized, as you see things like smart grid, which I think is going to be a great benefit to us, but it's going to be putting these systems online, potentially making them more vulnerable. The Internet of Things, I'm sure you've all heard of that buzzword, also potentially taking these things, putting them online. Great for productivity, great for our everyday lives, probably more efficient, lowers costs, all of that's great, but also makes them more vulnerable. And we actually have an opportunity here to think about security from the beginning, which we didn't do when we thought of the normal internet. So I certainly encourage people to take time to think about security as they start to bring these things online. The next thing, cyber espionage. Cyber espionage is huge. All nations do spying. We've spied forever. Other countries spy on us. That's just the way it goes. What's different about cyber is the massive scope and scale and the ease in which you can do it. The thought that you don't even have to enter a foreign country anymore, that you can hack in remotely and have access potentially to vast troves of data is incredible. It's incredible. It's possibly a game changer. I would argue that this, when it comes to the loss of intellectual property, is perhaps a more insidious threat right now than the threat to critical infrastructure. This is a longer-term threat to our American competitiveness, right? The United States, as a matter of policy, conducts espionage, but does not steal secrets from other nations' companies and give them to our companies for a competitive advantage. We do not do that. Other countries do that. And that puts us at a competitive disadvantage over the long run and potentially undermines our economy. And this is not really a good answer for this yet. It's not really a good answer for this yet. We're not going to bomb China because they stole our IP, right? That's not an act of war. We're not going to do that. Also, diplomatically speaking, you can't go to another country and yell at them for spying on us when we spy on them, right? Try to make the argument that it's, oh, we don't do economic, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be totally lost, right? It's a very, very hard argument to make. This right now, again, not a very good answer and something that they're starting to spend more time on, but a very, very serious problem. Okay, so what does this mean for warfare? Right now, as I mentioned, the offense kind of has the advantage. It's a lot easier, it's a lot cheaper, it's a lot quicker, and it pays well, right, to be a malicious actor in cyberspace. Defense, very hard, very difficult, very expensive. This is, right now, the trend is only even more so as the tools are becoming, on average, cheaper, more widely available. Just about anyone in this room could go online and if you knew what you were doing and knew where you were going, could buy a botnet, could buy a piece of malware to use for some reason, right? It's accessible and it's not terribly expensive. And the tools are becoming more and more advanced and more available. That's really bad when it comes to organizations like terrorist groups. As I mentioned before, they have a lot of intent but not a lot of capability. If these things keep becoming cheaper and more widely available, they will have the capability and they will have the intent and they will use it. And that is a very bad scenario. Also, as I mentioned, typically these diplomatic tools don't work very well. It's very hard to make the case, that other countries should spy on them like we spy on us, for example. Also, cyber will impact different nations differently. In the United States, we think of cyber as in securing our intellectual properties, and securing our government secrets. Other countries view cybersecurity as stifling free speech. How do you come to agreement with that? That's something that we absolutely cannot do. So how do you see eye to eye with a fundamental difference like that? There's no good answer for that. And then finally, the last implication for cyber warfare is the U.S. actually needs to think about divorcing cyber from surveillance and mature its capabilities. Right now, those capabilities are essentially linked. An analogy in my mind would be, again, I'm an Air Force guy, I keep coming back to that, would be in the 1930s, the Air Force was actually called the Army Air Corps and it was part of the Army. And it wasn't until the 1940s that it was separated and became the strategic asset that it is today. It had its own doctrine, it had its own capabilities, and became something that's now incredibly valuable. I think this needs to happen in cyber too. I think it needs to be divorced from surveillance so that it can mature and become more useful to us. It can also become more useful to us across the facets of national power, right? Diplomatic, political, economic. Imagine if we were able to use this as informational power, right? Instead of just trying to spy on people, we could say, okay, China, we're going to take down your firewall and let information flow freely in their country. That would probably terrify them, right? That would be a big deterrent to them. Or what if there was some strife in a country, in the Middle East or Africa, and their leadership was trying to cramp down on the internet, and we set up Wi-Fi so that their free Wi-Fi so that their freedom fighters could actually communicate. That's not really something we do now, but something I think we should consider, right? We should consider developing this as its own mature discipline. And hopefully that will come to pass. Okay, so finally, what does this all mean for you? I think it means a lot. Cyber is impacting all of you. If you're not being spied on directly by a nation state, you're probably having your private information, is possibly vulnerable to an organized criminal organization, right? That wants to take it. So this is tremendously impactful for you. We're going through these debates right now. We need to figure out where we stand on security, on privacy. We need to figure out what is the role of the government. What should we regulate? What should we let the free market handle? Will too much regulation stifle innovation? All of that. All of those things are up for debate right now. And if you have an opinion on it, you don't need to be an engineer. You can be anybody in the world and voice your opinion on it. These debates are happening right now. This will shape right now how cyber operations are conducted in the future. And one last thing to kind of keep in mind, and I've been guilty of this before as a Pentagon guy, security is not a means. I talked about a lot of security in this lecture, but security is a means, it's not an end. You have security in order to protect something valuable. You don't have security just to have security, because then you end up with a security state. And as Benjamin Franklin said, those who sacrifice freedom for the sake of security deserve neither. So you need to think about what we have that's valuable and how we want to protect it, not just lock everything down. And that's it. So with that, I will pause and invite you to ask any questions.